What's up, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. I want to address last week's video very quickly. A lot of you guys noticed that there either wasn't one or you saw one and it got deleted. I did cover the disappearance of Zach Barnes, but there unfortunately were a few issues. His family was worried that it might affect the coronial inquest with my video being up, so I decided to just go ahead and take it down so that was no longer an issue. The last thing that I want to do is jeopardize any potential positive movement in a case. I do want to say thank you to all of you that went ahead and donated to the GoFundMe to donate towards the coronial inquest, and for those of you that have asked about his name, so you can do your own research and follow his Facebook page. All you guys have to do if you want to do that is just search Zach Barnes. It comes up pretty easily. He is from Australia. But now on to today's video, and before I dive into that, I need to say a huge thank you to Audible. You guys, Audible is absolutely awesome, and this in particular makes me love this company even more. If you're not familiar with what Audible is, it is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment as well as audiobooks. They have the most vast array of categories, so there is absolutely something for everyone, whether you want to learn about religion, fiction, true crime, science fiction. There's even comedy, there's news. Right now, Audible is doing something so amazing. They understand the times that we're under right now, and they want to give existing members a lot more to enjoy while we're all stuck at home. All current members right now can download the entire list of Audible originals, and usually you're only able to pick 2 from the changing list, but members will still receive their 1 free audiobook of their choice as well, and there's even a perk in there for those of you that are not members of Audible. Audible has decided, because of the current circumstances, to launch something called stories.audible.com, and this consists of hundreds of free titles to help everyone get their mind off of the stressful time. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to pay anything. No strings attached. All you have to do is go to stories.audible.com and they are yours to get your mind off of all this crazy mess that is happening. The audiobook that I'm listening to right now actually is about the case that I'm covering today. It is about the murder of Gina Hall, and it is called Under the Trestle. Ron Peterson Jr. is the author, and you guys, this author went above and beyond. He went to the same exact college, Radford University in Virginia. It's the same college that Gina went to, and he had heard about the stories. He went around the same time, and he listened to every single second of the 7-day trial that happened when her murderer was convicted. I highly suggest it to you guys. So if you want to become a member of Audible, all you have to do is go to www.audible.com/Danielle or text the code Danielle to 500 and you guys will get 1 free audiobook and again, unlimited access to the Audible originals as well as your 30-day free trial. Thank you again to Audible for sponsoring today's video, and now let's dive into today's case. This is going to be a very long video, I am assuming. I have a ton of information on this case. It is a solved case technically, but it falls under the solved no body, which I used to actually do a ton of. To this day, Gina's body has yet to be found, and it actually was the very first case in Virginia where someone was successfully convicted of murder without a body, and it was, I think, the 4th case ever in all of the United States, which is absolutely insane because the prosecutor on this case had only been working in that field for 7 months, you guys, and he completely made history for Virginia and was part of the first 4 in all of the United States. It's also pretty crazy because this was the first time that evidence from a tracking dog was used in court in the state of Virginia as well. There are just so many twists and turns in this. There's so many groundbreaking accomplishments in this, and her family is still to this day looking for her body. This happened in 1980, so it's been a very long time, but her sister has not given up. She refuses to stop searching, and the detective on the case currently also opened the case back up so that they could search for her body again, and I wanted to put another push out there and also encourage you to listen to Under the Trestle, the audiobook. Gina was 18 years old when she was murdered on June 19th, 1980, and she was a sweet, young, innocent woman. She had a difficult life, but she was the kind of person where you wouldn't even know anything that she was going through, because despite how difficult it was, she always overcame it. She always did it with a smile on her face. She always remained optimistic and positive no matter what, and that's just how everybody knew her. At the age of 2, she got into an accident that caused her to get very, very bad third-degree burns on the right side of her body from her shoulder, I believe, all the way down to her thigh. And if you don't know anything about burns, that's terrible. First of all, I'm surprised she did not die from it. Second of all, it is not as easy as just recovering from burns. It's never that easy. The skin, when it kind of scars the way that it does after a burn and heals, it remains very, very stiff, and it does not move, it does not stretch. The elasticity is pretty much completely gone. Because she was only 2 when this happened, she obviously had a lot of growing to do, and her skin just wasn't able to keep up with that. So from the time this happened on, she regularly had to go and get very, very painful procedures done in order to help her body stretch the way that it needed to for her to appropriately grow. But she took this in stride. She literally just went on with her life. She was thankful that she was alive. She was thankful that she was healthy otherwise. And she had a very, very supportive father and siblings. Now, her mother, from what I've seen, did not handle the accident very well. I think it's very possible her mother blamed herself, but I didn't see a ton of information about this. I just know that it caused her mom a lot of psychological problems. She struggled a lot with what happened, and eventually she left the family, leaving Gina's father, John, as the sole caretaker of Gina and her siblings. He was a great father, though, and he did eventually remarry. I believe the stepmother's name was Joan, and they continued to live a great life. She wasn't embarrassed about her scars, but she definitely sometimes just was worried people would judge her, so she learned how to cover them with her clothing no matter when it was, hot, cold, whenever. She always wore long pants and a long sleeve shirt, but it was easy as that, and she acted as if they weren't there. She was very, very intelligent. She wanted to become a nurse. She was also very talented when it came to sports. She was incredibly active. She played tennis, she played golf, she was really good at it. I believe her dad actually taught her how to play. She also did gymnastics. She competed a little bit, and that is actually where most of her friends came from because of her slight insecurities about her burns. She kept her circle very, very small. She basically wouldn't branch out a lot. She would become friends with those that were on the team with her, kept everything very small, and that was pretty much it. She was just a very focused and driven person. She was not driven socially. She just really wanted to be good for herself and be good for her future. She also didn't date anybody because she had this overwhelming fear that they were going to judge her for her scars, or they wouldn't like her because of them. It was something that she would frequently talk to her sister and her friends about, and it was very upsetting for her. She was even worried that she wouldn't be able to have children because her skin wouldn't stretch the way it needed to. She just was scared of being rejected pretty much. But those that knew her said despite all of that, she still had the best heart, and anyone that knew her knew that she did not have a mean bone in her body. After high school, she originally started off going to a local college to become a nurse, but she realized shortly, I believe after only 1 semester, that she wanted to do something a little bit more, so she transferred to Radford University in Virginia, and she grew up in Virginia in a few different places, but this is where she ended up going missing from ultimately, was around Radford, Virginia. She decided to go here not just because her sister Delana went here, which is someone she was very, very close with. She also liked it because it was bigger. It felt more like a university college experience. She was really excited. She decided she wanted to have more of a social life, which was a big, big deal for her. It also had a bigger nursing program, so she was excited about that as well. It was just a lot more opportunity. She quickly made friends with a group of girls around her, and they were like her security blanket entering this new world. They were very, very kind and close to her. They would go out dancing, which was something that Gina, first of all, was apparently very, very good at, and second of all, loved to do. She still, despite going out, wouldn't really drink. At most, she would have one drink. I think her favorite was a pina colada, but she even said that her favorite was a virgin pina colada. She thought it tasted better, so she wasn't a drinker. She didn't do drugs or anything like that. She really just wanted to go out and dance and hang out with her girlfriends. She eventually moved into an apartment with Delana, her older sister, and this leads us to her disappearance. Gina had been taking summer classes. I believe this was only her second semester that she was in at Radford University, and she took her midterms around June 18th, 1980, and she finished them, felt really great about them, and decided that she wanted to go out and celebrate by dancing. So she asked her sister, Delana, to go out with her that night, but Delana was, head first and some very intense studying for school and was exhausted from it, so she went ahead and passed on the night out. And Gina did something that she had never done before. Gina and Delana's father, John, had given them a brown Chevy Monte Carlo to share while they were living together and going to the same school together that summer, and Gina decided to take the keys and go out by herself. And I feel like I didn't make it a big enough deal earlier, like how little she went out and how little she did with other people. This was entirely new to her to even be in such a big college. It was entirely new to even have a group of friends like this. So even going out was new to places. So for her to go alone is just like a massive step for her to have taken. But she was excited and she was feeling confident. So she left at around 10 p.m. and this ended up being the very last time her sister saw her. She went to the Marriott nightclub in Blacksburg, Virginia. It was a very popular dancing place. Delana knew she was going here, but expected her to be home at a reasonable time. But at around 1 a.m. on the 19th of June, 1980, Delana received a phone call from Gina, and she sounded nervous. She didn't sound panicky enough to where Delana thought it was an emergency, but she definitely thought she sounded off. And Gina told her she was at a cabin at Claytor Lake, which was a nearby lake in Virginia, with a man named Steve. This was also, again, very unlike Gina because Gina was terrified of being rejected. She had not been in any relationships with anyone. She especially was not physically involved with anyone because that would require her scars being exposed. So this was odd, and Delana just told her to get back as soon as she could because she was just a little bit worried. After that, Delana went back to sleep, expecting Gina to show up home soon. But that's not what happened. Delana woke up around 6 a.m. and immediately went to Gina's room to check for her, and Gina was not there. When she looked outside, the car was not there either. Delana decided to call her dad to let him know that Gina had not come home, but keep in mind at this point in time, there are no cell phones or anything like that, so you kind of call and hope someone answers, and if they don't, you don't really have a good way of leaving a message with them or anything like that, so she basically just had to sit around and wait and hope that Gina showed up, because at this point, Gina had the only car. At around 7:30 a.m., so an hour and a half later, a male friend of Gina's showed up at the apartment, and this was just another huge red flag. This male was someone that she was very, very close with. He was in the Air Force, and he just so happened to have the weekend off, and they had plans set for a while for him to come early in the morning and visit her. I guess this was a potential romantic relationship for her, which A, made it even stranger that she seemed to be by herself with a man the night before when she had plans to be with someone the next morning. She never had a relationship, so for her to kind of have two things going at one time didn't really make a lot of sense. And also, Gina would never just leave someone hanging in the dust, especially when they were in from out of town and they usually weren't able to be around. Delana and this friend were thinking things through, and at this point, they're thinking there's only two explanations for Gina not being here. Either A, she got in a car accident on the way home and no one has found her, or B, someone's done something to her or taken her. So they decided to call a few more friends and drive as many roads as they could between the apartment and the lake. But the problem was that they had no idea what house Gina was at. Absolutely none. And Steve is such a common vague name that they had no way of knowing who exactly she was even with that night. So they were just kind of aimlessly driving around everywhere they could, hoping that they might pass by the car. By the afternoon, Delana was very, very concerned and decided to go ahead and call authorities. She still had not reached her father yet, so local police were informed that Gina was missing, but they kind of gave her the runaround. They said that college kids go missing all the time, and this is something that's very common, and she probably will just show up in a little while. She might be with a guy. She might still be drinking. Delana was told to call back in 24 hours. She was not happy with this answer at all, so she decided to go up to state police, but they told her the exact same thing. So at this point, all of Gina's friends are desperately looking for her, and authorities aren't doing anything. By late that Sunday night, Delana finally reached John, their father, and he was informed that Gina hadn't come home, and he said he would be there the following morning and they would figure it out from there. So now it's around Monday morning, and John Hall had shown up to figure out where Gina was. She still had not shown up. So they decided to again call and report her as missing, and this time it was successful. But they weren't willing to wait any longer, so they started their own search. And the operation they had going, you guys, I am very, very impressed with. They had a group of friends that was out searching for her. They also had a group of friends that was at a house, that were at a house and calling around to see if anyone had seen her. They had people, going back and forth on the roads, people speaking with the police. A couple of friends went to the nightclub to see, if anyone knew anything there. And finally, around the afternoon that Monday, something was found. The brown Monte Carlo was found parked under a trestle of the bridge going over New River into Radford, Virginia. And the state it was in was bizarre, and what's even more frustrating about this is that a cop had actually already passed the car multiple times. Meaning, if this had been reported, all of this may have been found a lot earlier and may have given this case a little bit more of a chance. At around 5 a.m., the 19th of June, so early Sunday morning, which would have been just hours after someone last spoke to Gina, an officer passed the car by the New River under the trestle, and the car had the trunk open and there was nobody inside of it, and the officer thought it was weird enough to notice it, but also saw that there was a car parked in front of it and behind it. And I guess this location was obviously close to the river, and it was a spot that people would park their cars so they could go and fish. So the officer kind of assumed that's exactly what was going on and didn't think to call it in, didn't think to check it out, nothing. And that's very frustrating, but I kind of understand this first kind of run by of the car. But then at midnight, so going into Monday at this point, hours and hours and hours later, the same cop passed by the car again, the same brown Monte Carlo sitting underneath the trestle with the trunk open. And this time he's like, okay, something's odd. So he ran the tags, and the tags came back to John Hall, which again is Gina and Delana's father. But the car wasn't reported as stolen. There were no flags on it or anything. So he just left it again. And I understand that there was no reason to believe, given the fact that it wasn't stolen, that there was a problem. But when you see a car parked in the same spot with the trunk open by a river, hidden underneath a railroad track, I feel like you should probably not assume. And it was even more frustrating because if he had gone closer to the car, it would have been very obvious that something was not right. The trunk wasn't the only odd thing about the car, the trunk being open. One of the inside handles of the car had been broken. The seat of the car, the front seat, had been pushed all the way back, and that was actually the first thing that Gina's friends noticed, because they always made fun of her because she was, not made fun of her, but they joked with her because she was only 5 feet tall, and when she would drive, she had to push the seat all the way forward. And there was this joke that their noses were always on the glass driving with her because she had to get so close. So this led authorities and Gina's friends and family to believe that she was not the last one that was actually driving this car. There was also very fresh bloodstains in the trunk, as well as hair that appeared to match the same color, length, and texture of Gina's. Samples were in fact taken from the car. At this point, DNA testing wasn't really a thing, so the most they could do was match the blood type. While searching around the car after being found, they also were able to find a blue towel nearby the car, as well as one of Gina's shoes on the other side of the trestle. So at this point, between the blood, the car being abandoned, the towel, one of her shoes, the fact that she hadn't come home, it became apparent that Gina had likely been killed. Her sister begged the local radio station to air a 30-second segment to alert the community in hopes of getting tips, and authorities meanwhile decided to ramp up their search. At the time that this happened, they weren't really sure what they were getting into, and there had been a shooting at around the same time, so most detectives and police officers were busy on the shooting, and they actually put a random highway patrol officer as the detective and person in charge on the case, and he had absolutely no experience doing it. But what's very cool about this is that he actually is known now for his skills. And no one expected him to go into this, a case this big, because they didn't know exactly what it was, and for him to totally blow it out of the water, and that's exactly what he did. The man's name was Clarence Austin Hall, and he was a force to be reckoned with. He decided to send officers out to Crater Lake because they had no idea who this Steve guy was. They had no idea what house Gina was in, and he wanted every single house to be checked. I'm talking 300 plus homes around Crater Lake he made officers go out to. They knocked on every single door. Unfortunately, it didn't go exactly as planned. A lot of these homes were vacation homes. People only came there during the summer, or they were only there on the weekends, so majority of them were not occupied. But those that they did speak to, that also didn't give them answers either. No one had any idea who this mysterious Steve was, and none had seen Gina, which isn't all too surprising because she would have been there around 1 a.m, and she at least was gone by 5 a.m. And we're talking about a Saturday night into Sunday morning. Not a lot of people would have been out. He also sent divers into the new river near the trestle under the idea that someone may have driven her there to dispose of her body. After all, the trunk was wide open. There was blood in it, as if a body had maybe been in there. A towel was thrown nearby. Her shoe was found nearby. But it was also proving to be very difficult because upstream was a dam, and it had the water flowing fast. So when divers originally went in, it was horrible visibility. The water was moving incredibly fast, which also meant it was very possible if she had been put in the water, she had totally been taken downstream at that point. So they searched for 6 hours as best they could the first day, and then they waited until the next day to slow the dam water down so that they could have better visibility and an easier time searching. But still, after that, absolutely no sign of Gina was found. The search for Gina's body is still to this day the most comprehensive search that has ever been done in Virginian history, you guys. They did not miss a single step. Clarence Hall made sure this girl's body was searched for endlessly. While they were searching, they were also still trying to figure out who on earth this Steve guy was, but it actually didn't take very long because Steve ended up coming to them. 28-year-old Stephen Epperly called and made an appointment to meet with Clarence Hall. And when he arrived, he seemed very calm and collected. He didn't throw up any red flags. He wasn't nervous. And he just straight up told authorities that he had been with Gina. He gave his entire timeline. He said that he went with his friend, Bill King, and a few others to the Marriott nightclub, and that is where he met her. He said he didn't know who she was before this, but he saw her dancing and they were kind of drawn to each other. So they danced for a few songs, and then he said that he asked her to go to Bill King's lake house to go swimming. Now, Stephen said she agreed to this, was super excited about it. He drove them there in her car because he had driven in with Bill King, his friend. He said that they arrived sometime after 1 a.m, and as soon as they got there, she wanted to call her sister. Said that he overheard the conversation and he heard Gina say to her sister that she'd be there the next morning. He said that after the phone call, they both went down to the dock to swim, but Gina decided to sit on the dock and just watch him swim. And after he got out, he said they went inside and they kissed some, but Gina refused to do any more because she said she had a bad experience before and would need to know him a lot better before she would sleep with him, basically. After this, Gina ended up telling Stephen that she had a friend coming very early in the morning, so she needed to get home. So he said at around 3:30 to 4, they both hopped in the car, and Gina this time drove. Gina drove him home to his home where he lived with his parents in Radford, Virginia, and then she left and he was asleep by 4 to 4:30. Now, Clarence Hall thought this all seemed to add up, but he wasn't fully convinced. So he asked Stephen to drive out with him to the lake house because they still at this point are trying to figure out where this lake house is, who it belongs to, all of that. And he was also hoping that this ride would kind of take down Stephen's barriers a little bit and maybe he would slip. So he asked him to recant the story for him. He was going to see if anything changed, and sure enough, it did. He suddenly remembered that his friend, Bill King, that he had been with at the nightclub, showed up to the home at around, I think, 3:30 to 4 in the morning with a woman named Robin. And Stephen claimed that both Bill, and Robin spoke to and saw Gina that night. Now, this easily could have just been something that Stephen just simply forgot, but since was now a potential homicide investigation, and you're now throwing in 2 other people that may have been the last to speak to and see someone who was, possibly killed immediately afterwards, this definitely changed things a bit. Once Stephen was dropped back off to the station and authorities knew where the house was, they decided to do a little bit of digging, and Clarence found the mother lode of information about Stephen. Now, when he first looked into Stephen's records, there was nothing but minor traffic infractions. There was nothing very alarming or serious, but he had this odd feeling. So he decided to ask around the police station to see if any of the police remembered Stephen Epperly's name, and this had the whole police station popping off, essentially. There were plenty of police officers that remembered all sorts of horrible experiences with Stephen Epperly. A lot of them remembered his name from a ton of different bar fights around town. Usually he was the one that started them, but no charges were ever pressed. There was a couple of police officers that had to go and break up a domestic dispute when he was a teenager, I think 18, 19 years old. He had hit his 15-year-old sister and then proceeded to assault his own mother. So all those charges ended up being dropped because of his mom, and they weren't on his record. There were also a few people that claimed he was potentially involved in some sexual assaults in another county, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. And then there were other people that went to high school with him and said, look, this guy is not good news. He's got a temper all through high school. He was known for being angry and very violent. He was very violent towards women. So Clarence at this point is like, okay, something's definitely wrong. So he decided to call around to different police stations to see if there was any more information on Stephen Epperly. And this is when he found out that Stephen had in fact been charged but not convicted in 2 sexual assault cases. The first time he was charged but not convicted, Stephen showed up randomly to his ex-girlfriend's apartment. She was asleep and he stood outside of her window losing his marbles for a while. And when she finally woke up and asked him what the heck he was doing there, he claimed that he was in trouble and he needed to come inside because he needed her help. But this was just a trick, because the second that she let him in, he slammed the door shut, threw her on the ground, choked her, and sexually assaulted her. And the only reason she was able to get out of the situation is because she had just had a baby, and this baby was in another room and woke up from all the noise and started crying. And she basically convinced Stephen to let her get up and calm her baby, and instead she just grabbed her baby and ran. She showed up to the police station covered in bruises, you guys, like so very obviously had been assaulted, and she pressed charges against him, but somehow he managed to get out of the charges. The second time, Stephen was at a local pool, and there was this 19-year-old young woman there, and she was talking about a party she wanted to go to, but she didn't know where exactly this party was at. So Stephen, trying to be the hero that he was, said that he would show her where the party was. That she just needed to follow him. He said he would drive, she could drive behind him, he'd show her the house, and that was that. Now, she already knew something seemed off about this, so it took a lot of convincing. When she finally agreed, they both hopped in their separate cars, but instead of taking her to this apartment where the party was, he took her to his apartment. And he somehow was able to explain this away when they got there and convinced her to come in and look at his new fish tank. Just like his ex-girlfriend, instead, he just slammed the door shut, locked it, choked her, pinned her down, and sexually assaulted her. And this girl, when she testified against him, said that she thought she was going to die. He choked her so badly that she ended up passing out for a short period of time and then was able to get up and escape. But guess what? He still managed to get out of it. The more that Clarence Hall would dig, the more stories like this he would find. Stephen was a football player. He went to Virginia Tech and played football there for a while. I believe he played football in one more place. That's what he wanted his career to be, but it just didn't end up panning out. And they spoke to a lot of his teammates, and his teammates had nothing good to say about him, like literally at all. They spoke again about his horrible temper, the fact that he had a very short fuse. When he would get going, he did not know when to stop. They said that the first sexual assault allegation that they heard of, they all didn't really question it because that's just how he treated women. When Stephen Epperly would be around any women, he would prey on them, basically. He was a predator, and it was known by essentially everyone. He never just spoke to a woman just to speak to her. His end goal was always sex, and he either got it willingly or he took it. It was one way or the other for him. It was expected. And once they started hearing about these sexual assaults, after the first one, they kind of were like, okay, this isn't good. But then after the second one, they entirely pushed him out of their friend group. His MO was basically sneakily charming women, tricking them into being alone with him, and then forcing them to have sex with him. It was bad. He respected nobody. Clarence Hall realized through all of these stories that he did not even respect his own mother or his sister because he assaulted both of them. It was horrific. And what was even scarier about this was the fact that these two sexual assaults that he was in fact charged for but not convicted of, they had a lot of commonalities between each other. So it made it very likely that he was in fact responsible for both of these, but somehow managed to get off. But what was even scarier was the fact that they also had commonalities with Gina's disappearance. It sounded like the exact same setup. He randomly saw a woman, decided that was who he was preying on that night, tricked her into being alone, sexually assaulted her. It went wrong, but this time she ended up dead. They decided to bring in Bill King and Robin to speak to them because Stephen said, hey, they spoke to Gina that night. That proves that she was fine when she was with me. But they got something so wildly unexpected. Bill told his entire timeline of events, and it was very, very incriminating against Stephen. Bill said that he was house sitting for his parents. That was the house at the lake. And he had been with Stephen that day. They went to the house together. They checked the house out. And they were kind of under this mutual agreement that if either of them, managed to end up with a woman that night, that they would take them back to this house. And Bill made it very clear to Stephen that he was able to do that as well. And Stephen ended up overhearing a conversation about how Bill and some people were going to the Marriott nightclub, and he pretty much invited himself. Bill said at around 11 o'clock they arrived to the Marriott nightclub, and they showed up at the exact same time as Gina, who showed up by herself. They parked directly beside her and walked in at the exact same time, and this is likely when Stephen saw her for the very first time and decided that that's kind of who he wanted to prey on that night. Bill said once they were in the nightclub, all of his group stuck together, and he did notice that Gina was kind of off in her own group, so it did appear that she maybe found people that she knew at this nightclub when she got there. But still, for the most part, she was kind of alone. She wasn't with her core group of friends or her sister. And Stephen ended up asking her to dance. They did dance for a few songs, then they parted ways, but Stephen kind of wasn't letting her go. He continued to go up to her and talk to her, and everyone that knew Stephen knew, yep, here we go, like this is who he's laid his eyes on, and they all knew how it was going to end. Because again, they said Stephen didn't just talk to a woman to talk to her, he had his end goal in mind always. So it wasn't very surprising when Stephen approached Bill and asked if he could take someone back to the cabin at the lake for a swim. He also asked to borrow Bill's car, but Bill said he absolutely couldn't let him drive that. I think it was his stepdad's very expensive car, so he said no. And at this point, that's when Bill kind of put together that Stephen was going to take Gina home. And neither of them knew Gina very well. They had just met her this night. Gina and Stephen started to walk outside, and Bill did walk with them, I guess just to kind of give Stephen the keys and all of that. And Bill started to realize that Gina seemed very confused. He said that he couldn't tell if Gina knew she was going alone with Stephen to the cabin. It seemed to Bill like Gina was under this impression that all of the friends were going back to the cabin. They were all going to go and take a swim in the lake. She just seemed like she was very unsure about what was going on and maybe had been lied to or misled in order to get in the car with Stephen. And that's exactly what happened next. Stephen got in the driver's seat because he knew the way to the lake, and off they went alone. Bill said that around 4 a.m., a couple hours later, he ended up meeting up with Robin, which I believe was an ex-girlfriend of his, and they decided to go to the lake house. And he said when they got there, Gina's car was there, but all the lights were off. And they were worried they were going to scare someone or alarm someone or interrupt something. So they made sure to make tons of noise when they came in. They turned all the lights on. I believe Bill called out to Stephen a couple of times. And after a minute, Stephen called back to Bill, but Bill couldn't see him. I think one was at the bottom of the staircase and one was at the top, so they couldn't see each other. And Bill was like, you know, hey, I'm here with Robin, we're going for a night swim. And Stephen said, oh yeah, well, I'm here with Gina still, but she has to go home, so we're leaving now. And that was kind of it. But Bill didn't think much of it, so he and Robin went out to the dock to swim. And that's it. Neither Bill or Robin saw Gina or heard Gina at all. The only thing they saw was Gina's car. Stephen was the only one to speak to Bill and Robin did actually see him for a split second. He was shirtless, wearing a towel, and it appeared like he was drying off, but that is it. So Stephen lied. Gina never saw or spoke to anyone that night, and this is kind of the first time that Stephen really cracked his story a little bit. Bill said that the following day, he ended up inviting everyone back out to the lake house for a barbecue, and Stephen did show up, and he at one point asked to go inside to make a drink. And this is another kind of odd thing that happened, but at the time, Bill didn't think much of it. Stephen was inside for a very, very long time, and Bill asked him jokingly when he came out, like, what on earth he was doing, and his response was that he couldn't find, I think, like a bottle opener or something that should have taken a couple seconds. He had been to this lake house multiple times. He would have known where it is, and even had he not been able to find it, it would not have taken him as long as it did to find it and come back out. But again, hindsight was 20/20, because other than that, Stephen was acting completely fine that day. He was not acting off, strange, nothing. Bill said he had no idea Gina was missing at this point, and it actually took, I believe, a couple of days, if not a few weeks, for him to figure this out. Bill said he was driving in the car, I think home from work one day, and he just so happened to hear the 30-second segment that Gina's sister put on the radio. And he immediately panicked. He went to a local gym that all of his guy friends would hang out at, and when he got there, they all had heard at this point as well, and all of them were very nervous about Stephen. They were really worried because they knew how he was, so Bill decided to leave and go straight to Stephen's work to confront him about this. And he showed up and he was like, did you know that Gina's missing? Like, you were last with her. She literally went missing right after you were at the lake house with her. You need to go to the police. You need to get ahead of them so they don't think that you've done anything and so no rumors can spread. Like, this was my lake house. It was a big panic, and Bill was very worried about Gina and how she disappeared and why she disappeared, but the only thing Stephen had to say was, who knows that I was with her that night? That's never a good sign. So at this point, between that and what Bill knows about Stephen, he was very, very concerned. At this point, Stephen did in fact take his advice, and Stephen did call the cops. That's when he ended up making the meeting with Clarence Hall. But what he didn't know was that Bill was also speaking to police, and authorities went with Bill to search the house at the lake. Now, Bill said nothing seemed off inside at all that night or the next morning, but the second investigators got in there, because they were trained, they were able to spot clear as day that a horrific crime scene had been attempted to be cleaned up. There was blood both all inside and all outside of the house. Blood was found on a golf shoe, a dustpan, the refrigerator door. A large stain, I think about a foot around, was found on the living room floor. It was faded to a light pink, so clearly someone had tried to bleach it but did not successfully fully bleach it. And probably the most disturbing thing about this blood stain in particular is that Bill said that he and Robin ended up laying on the floor right there in the living room for a while that early morning, and he remembers feeling the wet spot, but he thought in his head at the time, they were here swimming, it's probably just like from wet clothes or a wet towel. Little did he know, Gina, who he had just seen hours earlier at the club, had been killed, and her blood, that was her blood that he was laying in, basically. They decided to go through and take inventory of the entire house to make sure they weren't missing anything, and they did, in fact, figure out there were quite a few things missing. There was a blue towel, if you're picking up what I'm throwing down, the last thing Robin saw him in, a blue and white striped towel. There was also a bath mat missing. Tons of different cleaning supplies were missing. A quilt was missing. And they also ended up finding Gina's ankle bracelet that she constantly wore broken on the staircase. So this was obviously a huge problem because there's evidence of a crime scene here. Stephen had basically lied his way up and down all around the police officers. Even his own friends were questioning him and throwing him under the bus. Forensic testing then just isn't what it is now, and it was very, very difficult. They did take all the samples from the home, and they were able to find that it was O positive blood again, so likely the blood in the house was the same blood from the trunk of the car, which likely in turn was Gina's blood. They also found it very interesting, again, that I've already mentioned, that the blue towel that was missing from the home was actually found near Gina's car. Bill's parents did confirm that that was in fact the towel that they usually had at their home. They also found it odd that Stephen was the last one to be wearing a blue towel when Robin saw him. It was very obvious what happened, but authorities just really needed to prove it. But they were still searching for Gina. They still had not found her, and without her, they didn't think they would ever get a conviction. At this point, it had been past 2 weeks since she disappeared, and they decided to go back and research the area where her car was found, and they discovered that the clothes she had worn that night had been discarded there after the fact. And it was obvious someone had come back to the scene where the car was left and dropped the clothes off in the exact same spot. The clothes were bound very, very tightly. They were not ripped or anything like that, but they were completely covered in blood, and they did have 2 sets of hairs on them. One that was very obviously Gina's hair again, and the other was pubic hair, and it matched that of Stephen Epperly's. They also were able to find fibers on this clothing as well, and they were consistent with fibers from the carpet at the lake house. And on top of finding the clothing, they also found the second striped towel that was missing. They decided to bring in a man named John Preston, who was a dog handler, to see if they could get any idea what exactly happened around the car was abandoned. I believe their thought process was that they would kind of be led, maybe the direction of where the person went after dropping the car off, or potentially where this person took Gina's body. And what this dog did absolutely blows my mind. I don't think I've seen anything like it, and there is a whole lot of people that fight this. This man's work has apparently been thrown out a couple of times, but this case it has not. So he brought the dog. At this point, he did not know there was a suspect in the case. He had no idea who Stephen Epperly was. The dog was just given a scent. And the dog started at where the car was, Gina's car, and followed a trail, went across the bridge, across the river, did a couple of circles around town in Radford, and then this dog, I kid you not, walked straight up to a house, went right on the front porch, sniffed the doorknob, and sat down. And when the dog handler was like, this is clear as day, whose house is this? Whoever's house this is, whoever lives here has something to do with it. This dog had gone to Stephen Epperly's front porch. Authorities were flabbergasted at this, and at the same time this was happening, Stephen Epperly was being interviewed. I think he was also taking a polygraph, which he failed, and they walked in and they told him what the dog had done, and all Stephen Epperly did was put his head in his hands and say, that is a damn good dog. But unfortunately, despite everything that seems to directly point towards Stephen, even Stephen's own answer speaking to authorities, everything was circumstantial. But the more digging they did, they just kept unearthing horror stories, and it felt like they were fighting this battle that seemed impossible to win. They found a letter in Stephen's room while searching it from a woman he had sexually assaulted, adding just another woman to his growing list of victims. And in her letter, she told him how he destroyed her and how scared she was to report him, and that she would no longer feel safe ever. And he had kept it. He kept this note from her like it was a trophy. He didn't care what he did to this woman and the pain that she had. Like, he kept it as a trophy. And it makes me wonder if that's why the clothes were bound the way that they were and why they showed up after the fact. What if he kept these clothes as a trophy as well, but when authorities got too close, he realized he had to throw it somewhere. Authorities finally released that Stephen Epperly was their main suspect, and this caused the town to be in a huge uproar because everyone in the entire community had banded together to look for Gina and to figure out, what on earth happened to her, and to support her family, and to hear that one of their own, had potentially killed her in such a horrific way and had done all these other horrific acts to other women and gotten away with it, people were pissed. So he was receiving constant death threats to the point where he had to move to Ohio. But yet again, something suspicious happened in Ohio as well. Within 5 days of moving there, you guys, 5 days, the same town that he just so happened to move to, a 25-year-old woman went missing in a very similar fashion. There was no sign of forced entry in her home, so she either let someone in willingly or someone managed to convince her to come out. Her car was found abandoned nearby, and then 1 month later, her body was found in the middle of a cornfield. Authorities tried desperately to see if they could connect this murder to Stephen Epperly and possibly then to Gina, but unfortunately, they just could not find enough evidence despite the fact that this fit his MO perfectly. Bill, meanwhile, continued to come forward with information about his friend. He apparently directly asked Stephen, cops got him too, if he killed Gina, and his response was not, oh my gosh, no, I would never do anything like that. It was, I guess we will see, which again, another unsettling thing. Bill was also in contact with an attorney for very obvious reasons, and Stephen asked if his attorney would represent him as well, but even more disturbing, Stephen asked Bill if he could ask his attorney what exactly cops could do to him and if cops could still do anything to him if they weren't able to find a body. So if that doesn't tell you kind of what's happening here, I don't know what does. That's like the closest thing to a confession that he has given to this day. No stone was left unturned, and Clarence Hall, the highway patrol officer turned detective, is, like I said, still known to this day for the incredible work that he did on Gina's case. He questioned Stephen the best he could. He ran down every witness he possibly could. They searched everywhere. And they began to realize at a certain point that they couldn't wait much longer if they were going to charge Stephen because he was a wild card. They knew they only had circumstantial evidence, but he was leaving this terrifying wake in his path and had been his entire life, and they didn't want him to harm anyone else and get away with it. It was very apparent he had already, gotten away with 2 other sexual assaults that they knew of for a fact, and they didn't want him getting away with doing whatever he may have done to Gina. They were so sure he was responsible that despite being told they were risking their entire career charging someone for murder, first-degree murder at that, based on circumstantial evidence alone, they didn't care. They decided to go for it. Stephen was charged with first-degree murder. He had no witnesses at all at his trial, and he pled not guilty. He never wavered on this. Meanwhile, the prosecution brought forward 30-plus witnesses, and I believe 70 to 80-plus pieces of evidence. Circumstantial evidence, but still evidence. Bill testified against Stephen, confirming everything that he brought forward to police during the investigation, as well as confirming Stephen's violent history that he had basically watched unfold in front of him. A very unexpected witness also came forward, a man named Bill Cranwall. He apparently was known as the person that everyone could go to for advice. He was, this older man, and Stephen went to him in the weeks after Gina's disappearance and asked him a very weird question regarding the situation. And little did Stephen know, Bill Cranwell had been roommates and teammates with Gina's father, John Hall. And so it was disturbing enough for him that he went to authorities concerned that Stephen was involved in what happened to Gina. And as I stated in the beginning of this video, this was the first time evidence from a tracking dog was used in court in Virginia, and it took only 2 hours of deliberation for the jury to find that Stephen was guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. This was the first time this had ever happened in Virginia. That's not even it. Like I said in the beginning of the video, it's not just the first time. A prosecutor that had only been working as a prosecutor for 7 freaking months risked the entirety of his future career. He was so certain he could prove without a doubt that Stephen was guilty. And sure enough, he managed to freaking do it, you guys. And not only that, but the investigator on the case wasn't a trained investigator. He was a highway patrol officer that just cared enough and did enough to make that much of a difference in a case. And while this dangerous man was finally put away, Gina's body had still not been found. And I believe authorities searched for it for a while, but eventually the search for her body was closed. In 1994, when Stephen was first eligible for parole, he did attempt to get parole and it was denied. He continued this every 3 years when his parole again came up. I think even as recently as 2018, but he has still been denied to this day. He's also tried for an appeal multiple times, but it's always been denied. The Supreme Court has even fully refused to look at his case. It's been said that the main reason all of this is being denied is because he's refusing to tell Gina Hall's family where her body is. And no one wants to listen to what he has to say because he's basically just torturing this family from prison. He is still committing this horrific act while being locked up, and everyone is sick and tired of it. The search for her body was closed, as I already said, but 10 years ago they decided to reopen it. A detective named Andy Wilburn really wanted to figure out where Gina was and get this final bit of closure for her family. He went over the case completely, all over again. Like, re-interviewed witnesses, went to all the locations again, researched locations, but still nothing so far has been found. He decided to bring in new technology as well, which could always benefit an older case, especially something that happened in the 80s. Things have changed so much. So he brought in this ground penetrating sonar to different places where it's believed she may have been buried. Stephen Epperly worked at Radford University. He was a groundskeeper, so they wondered, because at the same time all of this happened, there was construction going on. A new building was being built on Radford University. Literally right after she disappeared, concrete was poured. So there was a lot of speculation that he maybe buried her under where this concrete would be poured to really solidify the chance that she was not going to be found. And given the fact that he even said something to Bill about, what can happen if a body's not found, he seemed pretty confident that no one was going to find her. But despite using this sonar, they were not able to find anything. It was also possible that he didn't go as far as going to Radford University. If you think about it, if you kill someone, you want to get rid of that body fast. So he likely would have done it closer to the lake. There were also a few different construction sites there as well that they believe she could have been buried under. I don't know if any of those have been checked. I don't know if they checked the new river again, but I do know that's another possibility. We already spoke about this before, that the currents in this river are very, very strong. The dam creates a lot of fast-moving water, and it's very possible if she was thrown in, she was very, very small, didn't weigh a whole lot, she easily could have gone downriver very, very quickly. That's probably the most believed theory, that she was tossed in the lake before the car was abandoned. There is another theory that some have, that she maybe was actually tossed in the lake instead of the river. After all, this was basically in the house's backyard where she is thought to have been killed, where there's evidence of this horrific attack. But I don't know how that would have been pulled off. I don't think he would have just thrown her off the dock right there. Bodies eventually rise, and she may not have gone very far. The currents in lakes aren't nearly as fast as in rivers. There was a report that there was a boat around the house, Bill's house, early in the morning, but Bill's family themselves didn't have a boat, and a lot of people think he may have, gone, stolen a boat, taken her body to the middle of the lake, and thrown her there. But that, to me, seems like a whole lot of steps, he would have had to take. Since it was a lot of vacation homes, if he stole the right boat, I doubt anyone would have noticed it, but for no one to have seen more than that or heard more than that, I don't know how possible I think that is. There has not been a whole lot of activity since, or tips coming in on the case. When Under the Trestle was released, they did have an influx in tips coming in, but I don't know if any of them led authorities in any new direction. But her family is still trying desperately to locate her body, and authorities are doing what they can as well. Because again, this is the closure that her family needs. It's one thing to have this monster put away, but it's an entire other thing that they still don't even really know what happened to her. And he's not giving any answers. Everyone believes he will never speak about it. They didn't have the opportunity to bury her. That's a whole other chapter that they are still just paused at. They're just stuck there until her body is found. I hope this story did something for you. To me, it really shows the impact that people can have, even if it doesn't seem like they have all of the experience in the world or all the knowledge in the world. If you've got the right set of morals and you've got drive and you actually give a crap, you can go so far in helping a case. And I really hope again that you guys took something from that. Those of you that want to become prosecutors, or those of you that want to become, police officers or work anywhere in the justice field, I just encourage you to be like these people, because I think it's outstanding what they did. But that is all I have for you guys today. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Gina's story. I hope this is one of those cases where I'm able to sit down and say that closure was finally brought to her family. I know that there's definitely a lot of people that are trying to get that for them. But thank you guys so much. Again, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to become a member of the Hallen fam so we can hopefully bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.